To all my hustlers, dreamers, love dealers, I'm that kind of girl. Work hard, play hard, for my own heart, might just rule the world. I'm on fire, can you feel the heat? You can try to, but you can't stop me.
This is Marcy Burrows and Carol O'Savin hosting the Midlife Mavens podcast, where we chat candidly about sex, love, relationships, and life for women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. We're both psychologists who specialize in relationships and sexuality, but this isn't therapy. Thanks for joining us to discuss the ups and downs of life in the middle. We hope our conversations inspire and empower you.
A quick disclaimer. We're both psychologists who specialize in relationships and sexuality, but this isn't therapy. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional services from a psychologist or other qualified mental health professional. The use of any products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Let's get into today's episode.
Welcome to today's episode. Today we thought that we would talk about balance in general. As we were going over our topics, we realized we had a lot of different topics related to balance, and we started thinking about all the things that throughout life women have to juggle and balance, and thought it would be a good overarching discussion about why is it as women that we take on so much, or we feel like we have to do so much and balance so much.
And then come back in future episodes to talk about aspects of that balancing game that we play in more specific areas of our lives. So today felt like more, as we talked about, it felt like more of a theoretical exploration of the issue of balance and the wide-ranging impact that it has in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I shared with you when we were having this discussion that I used to have this image when I was working and my kids were younger of the cat in the hat balanced on the ball and juggling the ball and dishes and the fish, and it looks like the fish is going to fall. And that I would always have this picture. And I still sometimes I have different things I'm juggling, but still frequently have this feeling like something's got to go, that the fish is about to fall.
And that's often the case, that we only start to make changes to impact all of the things that we're juggling, or the number of things that we're juggling, when we feel like something's going to fall, when something feels like we're losing it. And if we don't make changes, the fish is coming out of the bowl, or whatever the image is.
But then kind of thinking about, why is it that we find ourselves in this place so many times? Why is it that life has to get so out of control feeling before we're willing to take a look at it and make changes? And where does that pressure to take on so much? For me personally, I think a part of it is perfectionism. It's not just take it on, but do it well. Kind of looking at, can I be the best therapist, be the best mother, be the best partner? Can I do all of that at this really high level and do it all? And feeling like something's got to give.
And where does that come from? That's the question I keep coming back to. Why do we have this idea that we should be able to do that? I tend to be more women focused and certainly more knowledgeable about women in the world. So perhaps what I'm about to say is not at all accurate, and I'm willing to hear that it's wrong. I feel like men don't have this pressure. I guess you and I sort of talked about this a little bit last time, and you said that your experience is that it might be a little bit different for some men. But I have this myth in my head that all men have to do is do a good job at work and bring home a decent paycheck, and that's enough. Women have to do work and motherhood and partnership and keep themselves in good shape and have good friendships. It feels like men get off the hook a little bit. But I think you shared it's not quite that way. Your partner still has a lot of the demands that you have.
I don't know that that's the norm. I think that maybe there's exceptions to that, just like with any generalization. I think that my partner's an exception to that. I have clients where some of their traditional gender roles are flipped, but I think in general that the idea we get from society is that men are responsible for the finances and bringing home the paycheck, and traditionally women were more in charge of the home, but then a lot of women work now. But then you still have all those same responsibilities of the home. And on top of that, sometimes working 40, 50, 60 hours and still having these of childcare, cooking,
Right.
cleaning.
And maybe that does get to what we were talking about, that where these messages come from really have a lot to do with what we were exposed to. This podcast is speaking to women in midlife, but that's a pretty broad range. I'm 61 now. What I saw growing up was both of my parents worked because financially they needed to in order to raise 3 children. My father worked and came home and did nothing. My mother worked, both 40-hour-a-week jobs, both in factories, came home and then had to make dinner and make sure the kids had done their homework and take care of the kids when we were little. And there was a lot more to her responsibility. I have very clear images of my father sitting in the living room reading the newspaper or watching TV. He didn't come home and get dinner on the table or clean the house or do the grocery shopping. All of those were things that my mother did. And my parents certainly embodied the more traditional gender role. Maybe younger women in our midlife range saw more balanced demonstrations of who took care of responsibilities in the home. And it's not as skewed as my worldview tells me that it is or was.
I had a different experience. Both of my parents worked, and my mom was a school teacher, so she got off a little bit earlier than my dad. But my dad, I think, was kind of unique in that he was very involved in mine and my sister's life. And I remember we would go grocery shopping with him on Saturdays when my mom played tennis. And there's really special memories with him. And he did a lot of the carpooling things to sports and things like that. So I think I had a little bit of a different view. I think my dad was probably unique for the 70s, for a 70s dad. So I think I was fortunate in that way. My ex-in-laws, or my ex's parents, I guess they both have passed by now, but I still consider them my in-laws. They had much more traditional roles where even she worked. I don't think he ever did a dish in his life or cooked a meal in his life or knew how to balance a checkbook or anything.
Ironically, as my parents aged and after I was gone from the home, after I have an older brother and a younger sister, after we were sort of grown and gone, my dad did start taking on more responsibilities around the house. Really? He retired. Yeah, I'm sort of just now thinking about that. As they aged, he retired from work on disability while my mom was still working. So maybe that was the shift. He had retired and wasn't working outside the home. My mom still was. And it was more like, surprise, I made dinner kind of a thing. It wasn't like he always had dinner ready or he cleaned the house while my mom was at work. I think when the spirit moved him, he would decide that he was going to help out and he would do something. And we were all supposed to be grateful and impressed that he would do that thing. Not that it was so much of a shared thing, but the balance did start to shift a little bit, but not until my dad was home full time. So when we think about this, theoretically speaking, where does this idea that we have to do it all, that we have to juggle so many things comes from? Part of it is, what we see in our families.
Yeah.
What we're exposed to. And then part of it is what society tells us. And when I think about, I was born in 63. I have a younger sibling that was born in 69, and my mom started working pretty quickly after I actually don't remember specifically if she worked before my sister was born, but I know after my sister was born, she did. And I think the societal pressure there was that financially, it was just more costly to raise children, and doing it on a one income household became not a sustainable. Well, my parents were blue collar, so it wasn't sustainable in our household to raise a family on just one, my dad's income. And they needed both of their incomes to be able to make ends meet. So maybe that's one of the societal pressures of why women today still think that they have to do so much. Because most people need to have a dual income household in order to raise their family.
And so the same expectations are there, even though what a woman's day looks like has changed significantly with working 8 to 10 hours a day and still managing everything else. One of the things I hear a lot from my couples and from my female clients, or my female clients and couples too, is this idea of it might not necessarily be all the tasks that they feel like they have to be responsible for, but the oversight of everything, the responsibility load, the management of the household. Who's going to do what? When are the kids' assignments due? What school events are coming up? That they may be able to delegate and have their male partners jump in and do those things, but they still feel the weight of the responsibility of making sure everything is done. And if something gets missed, then the responsibility for that as well, that pressure feels like a lot for them.
The emotional burden, I've heard it referred to a lot. Instead of the male and female partners each just doing what needs to be done around the home, the male partner will often say, well, how can I help you? What would you like me to do? I would like you to figure out what needs to be done and just do it. Yeah. Sometimes, and we play a part in that. Those of us that are in male-female relationships, and maybe even in our same gender relationships, if one member of the partnership is taking the primary responsibility for the emotional burden of management of the household, we're colluding and we're playing into that expectation.
Right. And that's where some of that perfectionism comes in too. Like, and I think that not all women suffer from perfectionism, obviously. So I think that it's different for different women. But what I see a lot with clients who do have that perfectionistic piece is that the expectations of how something is done or when something is done kind of plays in there too. And so partner may not see that, I don't know, X, Y, and Z isn't, the towel's not folded the way that you want it folded. That's just not on their radar because that's not how they fold a towel. But we have certain ways and then think, okay, well, I might as well just do it myself if it's not going to be done right. I hear a lot from clients that I just want him to do it without me having to ask. I don't want to have to tell him what to do. I guess the flip side is how do I read her mind and know what's the most important to her? Because I might think mowing the yard is more important, or I might think cleaning the bathroom is more important than the laundry. But
right. So different expectations about what it should look like or what the order in which it needs to be done.
But then going back to expectations, though, I think part of that is driven by feeling like you are going to be the one that is judged if people come over and things aren't done.
Isn't that weird? I just recently had this conversation with a client. Her male partner's mother is visiting, and the mother-in-law fusses about the cleanliness of the house, but fusses at my client, the female partner, and doesn't fuss at her son, who's also got some responsibility for the cleanliness of the house. And my client was expressing some frustration about that. Isn't that weird? Well, I guess that goes back to what I was saying about what we see in our families, that some older generations have that more traditional, maybe his mom just automatically assumes that the wife is responsible for the housekeeping, even though that might not be true in the actual partnership. And then how do we navigate that? Because we feel judged by it.
Right. Well, it really is internalized patriarchy, if you think about it. Like, I'm putting on myself that I should be the one that cleans the house, and And there's that external piece of I'm getting judged, but also am I willing to like unhook from that and be like, okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
what they think about me is not my business. But there's a piece of it that, I'm putting that on myself too.
Yeah. And it's pretty common for, in my experience, you tell me if fits for you, Mercy, but it's been pretty common in my experience that when clients are talking about these household management struggles, it is pretty common for the two members of the partnership to have different ideas about what those look like and different ideas about what household management consists of and timeframes for it. And that can be a real source of conflict if it doesn't get talked about. And often women struggle to step into having those difficult conversations to resolve that conflict and get onto the same page. And then come from a place of feeling like the only solution is to do it themselves. And then carrying the resentment along with the burden of having to do it themselves because it's often harder for women to have those conversations with their male partners. And so part of changing that is changing our willingness and ability to have those conversations.
Yeah. I'm curious as we're having this discussion, we are talking about male female partnerships, but what do you notice being in a female female relationship?
The same thing. It's a very similar dynamic in my own relationship. But when I think about, because I work with a lot of LGBT clients and in same gender couples, it's almost always the same thing. Now, maybe it's because folks are coming to me because there's some struggle in their relationship, because that's one of my areas of specialty. And so that I have a skewed view maybe of these kinds of relationships, but it is often the case that one member is the one stepping in, taking on more of the responsibility. Maybe that's coming from their own perfectionism, as you said, or the messages that they got in their families, or it's coming because the other person is saying, I'm not going to do that. Or they're stepping out of taking on those responsibilities. Sometimes it is, I'm just sort of scanning my memory of clients that I've worked with, and sometimes it is that one member of the household is home more. Their job is less demanding, or maybe they don't work at all outside the home. And so maybe they're raising the kids or whatever the situation might be. So then by default, it sort of ends up being the person who has a less demanding job who ends up doing more of the household management kinds of stuff. I think the dynamics, I'm trying to answer your question. I think the dynamics are very similar, even in same gender relationships.
Yeah. I'm thinking about my same gendered couples that I've worked with. And it does seem like there usually is one partner who's kind of saying that I take the emotional load. And maybe that does go back to some of that perfectionism piece that, one partner's going to step up and say, okay, it has to be done to a certain level. And, maybe it's more about just interpersonal differences that one person tends to be more structure oriented, task oriented, and the other one isn't so concerned about it. And that's how it kind of falls out. And societal messages don't play as big of a role, maybe in terms of who does what, but then it goes to more of just interpersonal differences.
Well, and what just popped into my head as you were saying that, Marcy, is anxiety. And I know perfectionism is often born of anxiety. And that's the other dynamic that I often see playing out in couples, that the two people in the relationship have different levels of comfort with the chaos is probably too strong, but clutter or those kinds of things, and is willing to let it slide or doesn't feel the same kind of urgent need to clean it up the way that the other member of the relationship does. And I often see that in the context of anxiety. It's some people's anxiety, they don't want clutter. They don't want, I'm a baker. I can't, and I struggle with some anxiety. I can't start a baking project if the kitchen is already a mess. I will clean the kitchen in order to have it be clear and uncluttered so that I can start to make my own mess. And I will when I bake. Absolutely make a mess. But other people, I think, aren't bothered by that. My wife could probably go into the kitchen and start a cooking project, and she might clean up along the way or do some of that, but she wouldn't clean the kitchen as part one of her task of cooking whatever it is that she's going to be cooking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We wanted to just briefly interrupt the episode today to make sure that you all have our contact information. If any of the content that we've talked about in any of our episodes brings up issues that you would like to explore with a psychologist, we want to remind you that Marcy and I are both psychologists and would be happy to consider working with you if it seemed like it would be helpful. So a quick blurb about each of our practices.
So my practice focuses mainly on work with couples and individuals around issues related to relationships and intimacy. I'm an ASEC certified sex therapist and work with things like communication skills, life transitions within couples, issues related to intimacy, mismatched libidos, any type of sexual problems in the relationship. I work with issues related to trauma and how that impacts relationships. And I practice from a neurodivergent affirming lens.
And this is Carol. And I would describe my practice as one directed exclusively toward individuals who feel like they are struggling to change some long-standing patterns in their lives. So you might think of those as core issues that have been present in their lives for a long time that are no longer serving them in the way that they did previously. So I can help individuals figure out what those core issues are, figure out ways of dealing with them a little bit differently so that they don't encounter the same kind of obstacles in their lives.
I also work with a lot of individuals who identify as LGBTQ and with women who are encountering difficulty in their relationships with their moms as they age, or older moms who are having difficult relationships with their adult daughters.
If you're interested in working with either one of us, we both offer 15-minute consultations to assess if it seems like we'd be a good fit for your therapeutic needs. You can go to my website, which is Marcy, M-A-R-C-I, Burroughs, BURROUGHS, PhD, or Carol's website, which is drosabin.com, DROSABEN.com. We also have our websites in the YouTube channel notes for this episode. And now back to our episode.
Whether it's anxiety or perfectionism or societal messages or gender role stereotypes, whatever it is that we call it, it often is that it gets experienced and expressed differently between the members of the relationship.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's other factors that lead to feeling like we have to do it all or struggling balancing it. Well, one piece I think that we haven't really touched on is that there's some more pressure in terms of, like, going back to what we talked about last episode, women not aging, that like all the pressure of how we look in terms of making sure we're staying fit, staying thin, how we dress. I think there's more pressure for women in terms of that than men. And as part of that, as we're aging, even more so that we were just having a conversation about feeling like you're trying to, I don't remember exactly how we worded it, but just trying to kind of beat the clock in some ways and staying healthy and mobile and
to keep up with others. Yeah. That's what it feels like. Many of my friends are younger than I am, and I feel like I have to work harder to stay younger in some ways to keep up with them. One of my aunts she'll be 98 next year. She's really healthy, and yeah, she's amazing. And her hair is still dark. She colors her hair even at 98. And I remember somehow we got to talking about it one time, and she said that her husband, who my uncle, who's passed now, was Italian, and he had very little gray hair naturally when he passed several years ago now, but he just didn't get gray hair. And my aunt would say, if I let my hair go gray, I felt like I was out of sync with my own husband, and I didn't want that. So even though he's passed and he's been gone for a long time, she still colors her hair because she doesn't want to get out of sync with her husband.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what we do as women. We want to keep up with others, whether it's our spouses or our peer groups or
people we're seeing on social media that with filters. And
yes.
Yeah. When I think about how much time I spend on my appearance, it's a lot of time. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, but it is stuff that my mom would do all of that. I mean, like, that's kind of how I was raised, believing that's what you do. And so get your nails done, you get your hair done, you work out regularly, just all the things, which there's the health part for working out too, but the message I got wasn't about the health part back then.
One of the things that I was becoming aware of as we were talking was what I think I enjoy about the podcast is it gives us an opportunity to almost take a step back from what our experience is. You and I have shared that part of why we're doing this podcast is because it has been our experience that there aren't a lot of safe places to talk about these kinds of things. And people in our worlds just don't talk about these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And so as we're talking about these kinds of things, I'm aware that it's sort of giving me a little bit of distance to see the bigger picture about what's happening. And so many of the things that we talked about today, the way dynamics play out with different partners and different relationships, those kinds of things are just things that we don't very often think about and can put a completely different spin on what our own experiences are.
Yeah, it went a different place than I expected, which I think is a good thing. Because if we go in with an idea, like if we hold on too tightly to our views, then I think we're actually counterproductive to why we're doing this to begin with. Like, we kind of ended up in a place where maybe it's more about internal pressure that we put on ourselves and our own anxieties as a piece of it. I think I was going into it wanting to blame society a lot more than taking a look inward, but
right.
That's maybe an important piece. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it is. As with most situations, it's a little bit of both. Our internal pressures likely come from the societal pressures that we've experienced. And I say to clients all the time, you have been the unwitting and unwilling recipient of these kinds of societal messages your whole life, from the time you were a toddler. When a TV was on, when the news was on, when you weren't even trying to pay attention or gain information or education about something, it was being shoved down your throat. Every time you look at a magazine, every time you look at social media, we are the recipient of those kinds of messages. So it's no surprise that our internal talk, our internal environment is a mirror of what that societal message has been. And since there's not a lot we can do to affect the societal level messages, there is more we can do to affect how we're responding to them and responding to our own internal dialogue about what we should do or what is our responsibility or what we need to be doing in some way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So we get to decide if we stay balanced on the ball or if we're going to put the fish down before he drops.
Right. Or maybe there's just a different way, right? Maybe we don't have to do this all while balancing on a ball. You're going to get that image into this podcast, right? Because maybe we can juggle things better if we're not trying to balance on a ball at the same time, right? And what's your ball and what's my ball are probably different.
Yeah.
my fishbowl might represent my job. Your fishbowl might represent your job. So some of the aspects might be different, but we probably can think about them differently too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the important piece that I take from all this is that if we try to do all this while balanced on a ball, juggling all this stuff, it's really hard to balance on a ball and juggle a bunch of stuff and be present in the moment and really live a full, enriching life where you get to have valuable experiences with people you love and do things that you want to do and really be present for that. Something I talk to my clients about a lot is, I usually say, when you're on your deathbed someday, are you gonna look back and worry about whether the toilet was clean or the laundry was folded, or are you gonna wish that you had more time with your kids, with your partner? And almost always say, every once in a while, I will get someone who says, "I'm gonna worry about the laundry." But most of the time, it's I'm gonna look back and wish I had more time with the people I loved.
And that's what being present is about. When we're able to be present, we are immersed more in that experience. And so it sticks with us better. And so if we're not present, kind of back to your point about how present are you if you're juggling a bunch of shit and holding a fishbowl and an umbrella and balancing on a ball, we just remember the struggle. We don't remember the experience. And being present is about kind of enhancing our memories of that experience. That's what's important, not how many things you were able to juggle at one time.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've brought that to a clean conclusion or not, but we'll figure it out on the back end, and we'll follow up in future episodes with some of these kinds of topics as well. So thanks for joining us on this episode of the Midlife Mavens, and we'll see you the next time.
See you next time.
This has been Marcy Burrows and Carol O'Sabin with the Midlife Mavens podcast. As psychologists, we are big advocates for therapy. If anything in today's conversation left you feeling like there's more that you would like to explore, we encourage you to pursue therapy. In today's episode notes, we've listed links for several directories you could use to find a therapist who's a good fit for you. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in a future episode. Be sure to visit our Midlife Mavens Facebook page to share your ideas about future conversations.